this is a project that I've been involved in for the better part of 14 or 15 years. And the project began in a really unusual way for me. I was sitting in my office one day minding my own business and the phone rang. And I picked up the phone and it was one of our former graduate students who at the time happened to be working as a GIS analyst for the Soxhawtl Indian tribe. And he said, gee, the tribe that he works with, Soxhawtl, is an upriver tribe. Very, they have a lot of historical connections to the mountain. They view themselves as mountain people rather than sort of saltwater salmon fishing people. And they had a long cultural connection to the mountains, and in particular to mountain goats that were very culturally important to them. And at the time, I knew nothing about mountain goats. And he told me that mountain goat populations were way down in Washington state, and his tribe was very interested in why that was the case and what could be done about it. And wondered if I might be interested in working with them on this project. And my first thoughts were, knowing nothing about mountain goats, but what I did know about mountain goats is that they're found in, the mountains. And what I also knew about the mountains and the alpine zone in Washington state is that something like 95% of the alpine zone is protected in one way or another, and the habitat up there is intact. And so my first thoughts were, how could mountain goats possibly be in trouble? All their habitat is protected. What's the problem here? And so what I'll be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so is what we've done over the last 14 years to try to address that question. And when I began this project 15 years ago, I thought, well, this would be a great little project for one graduate student. But it's kind of been this Energizer Bunny project. It just kind of keeps going, and we keep finding new wrinkles that we want to explore. And so we've collaborated with a lot of different groups. Again, the Soxhawtl Indian tribe is responsible for getting this project started. We've also worked closely with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, U.S. Geological Survey, the Nature Conservancy. We've worked up in British Columbia with the Ministry of the Environment, collaborated with some other people at the University of Alberta that have done a lot of work on mountain goats, and also cooperated with the Washington Department of Transportation. As I said, I've had a lot of graduate students work with me on this project, and virtually everything that I'll be presenting today has been the work that's been completed by my graduate students. And here you can see the cast of characters that I've had working on this over the years. First grad student I had working on the project was Adam Wells, finished in 2006. And he's went on to get a PhD at Idaho State University and also worked on mountain goats for his PhD. Andrew Shirk then finished in 2009, Tana Buse 2010, Leslie Parks 2013, and my current graduate student Melissa Oscarson continues to work on this project. Over the years, I've been fortunate to be able to provide funding to take on about 50 undergraduate interns to work with us over the summer, and all of them at the end of the summer, the one universal comment I get from them is that they had no idea how physically demanding it is to do field research, because virtually all of this work involves working in the backcountry, miles and miles from the nearest road, carrying 40, 50-pound packs and hiking 8 or 10 miles a day while climbing several thousand vertical feet, oftentimes off trail. So it's very physically demanding work, but it's been real gratifying to have all these students involved in the project. Mountain goats are an icon. They've been used as a symbol of sort of the outdoors and sort of the rugged alpine habitat and the sort of rugged physique that's needed to navigate in that terrain. They've been used as an icon for everything from the Great Northern Railroad to mountain goat beer, which unfortunately I've never tasted, but it sounds quite attractive. Mountain goats are found throughout the Pacific Northwest, and here you can see this map showing their range. And as you can see, most of their range is not in the United States. Most of their range is in British Columbia, Alberta, and Southeast Alaska. The population down here in Washington State is very much at the southern extreme of the range. This map really isn't the best in that it doesn't do a particularly good job of distinguishing between the native population, the native range, and these introduced populations. And although it's a little hard to see in that map, the population in the Olympics is a non-native population. It was introduced into the Olympics in the 1920s. And in the 1920s, a group of hunters had this idea that it would be really cool to have a huntable population of mountain goats in the Olympics. So in 1925, they grabbed about a half a dozen goats from British Columbia. And then in 1927, or maybe 1929, the records aren't all that good, they grabbed another half dozen or so goats from Southeast Alaska, released them near Crescent Lake in the Olympics. And over the next 60 years, that population of 12 goats expanded through the Olympics and increased to a population of well over 1,000 animals by the mid-1980s. And the other interesting thing was when they released all these goats, you know, again, the goal here was to create a huntable population. Not very many years after that release, Olympic National Park was formed, and boom, that was the end of the option to have hunting in the Olympics. So by the mid-1980s, Olympic National Park was beginning to recognize impacts from mountain goats up in the alpine environment. They were beginning to see that the goats were simply overgrazing the habitat. This explosive population growth over the 50 or 60 years was probably facilitated by a number of different things. One is it was really good habitat. Number two, the native predator populations in the area didn't have a history, didn't have the opportunity historically to have a large ungulate prey animal available up in the alpine zone. So the predators really weren't up there very much. This initial population that they started with came from two very different and very healthy populations, and there might have been initially a bit of hybrid vigor going on there that helped to facilitate that explosive growth. But again, in the 1980s, the Park Service recognized that the population was a little bit too high, maybe a lot too high, plus it was non-native, and there was this great debate as to what to do about it. And as you might imagine, the debate at the one extreme, there was a group of people that was arguing that, hey, this is a non-native species in the Olympics. We need to make it go away. We need to eliminate this species from the Olympics. At the other extreme, there was a group of people that said, but they're really cute and they're white. Let's leave them alone. And so, predictably, the Park Service took the middle ground and decided to reduce the population. They ended up capturing about 400 animals and distributed them to game agencies throughout the western United States, including introducing about, the records aren't really very good, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 150, give or take, were released at different sites in the Olympics. A few features of mountain goats. Mountain goats live for maybe 10 to 14 years. Sexually mature at age 3. Both sexes have horns, and that's particularly important. I'll come back to that one in a minute. If you look carefully there, you'll see there is a difference in the shape of the horns. With the nannies, the horns, at least initially, go more or less straight up and then just sort of curve at the tip. And they're a little bit thinner, a little bit more delicate, a little bit more closely spaced, or a little bit spacing is a little different in the front. In contrast, the billies, the males, you'll notice the curve of the horn is a more continuous curve all the way from the base to the tip. So if you get a good look at a mountain goat from close range, you can distinguish the sex based on the configuration of the horns. And the distinguishing feature of mountain goats is that they're really, really good at rock climbing. And mountain goats are really good at hanging out on cliffs and being very comfortable on these precipitous cliff sites because they have to be. Those cliff sites are what we refer to as escape terrain, escape from important predators, including cougars, and up in Alaska, grizzly bears. And this was a photograph that was taken by my student, Andrew Shirk, with a not terribly long telephoto lens. And both the goat and my graduate student survived. So some history of mountain goats. Again, most of the mountain goats are in Canada and Southeast Alaska. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 100 to 120,000 goats on the planet. Most of those are in Canada and Southeast Alaska. Historically, we had about 10,000 goats here in Washington State. But again, back to that initial conversation I had with the Wallin tribe, mountain goat populations are way down by somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 to 90%. compared to historical levels. Well, why is that? Well, the short answer for why mountain goat populations are way down is simply because of overhunting. Way back in the 1940s and 1950s, when the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife first began managing mountain goat hunting, they acknowledged that they didn't really know very much about mountain goats, but they knew a lot about managing other ungulate populations all around the world. And based on lots of experience managing other ungulate populations, in particular deer, both white-tailed deer and mule deer, it was known that deer populations can withstand hunting pressure and harvest levels by hunters of in the neighborhood of 4% per year or even greater without having any impact at all on the population. And so based on that, the game agency said, well, let's manage mountain goats the same way we manage deer. Let's assume that they can handle that same harvest level. And that wasn't an unreasonable starting assumption, but in hindsight, there were two serious mistakes that they made, one of which they should have understood from the start, and the other which was kind of forgivable. The forgivable one is that they didn't realize that survivorship and reproductive rates for mountain goats are way lower than for deer. So that was forgivable. The thing that they really should have known better on is that with deer, only the males have horns. And so you can tell the hunters to only shoot the ones with the horns. But as you've seen, mountain goats, both sexes have horns. And it is possible to distinguish males from females, but it's very, very difficult for the average individual unless you're at very close range and know quite a lot about the species. So it turns out, you can kill an awful lot of males without impacting the population. But when you start killing females as well, that's going to have a bigger impact. And not surprisingly, the harvest in Washington State, obviously after those animals were shot, they could tell what the sex was. And about 50% of the harvest by hunters was with females. So that one they should have known better on. So here you can see this graph on the left that shows the number of permits and the harvest level from the 1940s up until the turn of the century. And you can see for most of that time, we were harvesting in the neighborhood of 300 or 400 mountain goats per year, which with an initial population of 10,000, that's in the neighborhood of 3 or 4%, 3% or so, which based on their experience with deer, they thought would have been sustainable. But as you can see, by the 1980s, the harvest levels began to drop, and they began to recognize that, hey, they'd overhunted. The populations were way down. The other mistake they made, which again was understandable, is they weren't really adequately monitoring the populations because it's hard to do so. It's expensive. You have to do helicopter surveys, which are quite expensive. Figure on the right, all these little triangles here show all the places where hunters recorded having killed a mountain goat over the entire period of record. And so based on that, you can see the mountain goats were extensively distributed throughout the Cascades. These colored polygons represent the places where mountain goats currently are found in the Cascades. So you can see that the spatial distribution has been reduced quite dramatically. We now just have these pockets of mountain goat populations, whereas historically it appears that mountain goats were well distributed throughout the Cascades. So, again, back to my initial thinking about mountain goats, what's the big deal here? All the habitat's intact. And certainly if you look at a satellite image of the Cascades from space, it looks like things look pretty good. There's the alpine zone. You see a lot of snowfields up there. Things look pretty good. Yes, we have these big urban areas down at low elevations, but at least a first look would lead you to believe that the habitat is pretty intact. Here's the major urban centers at low elevations. You add in the major roads going across the Cascades. Yeah, there's a few, but it doesn't really look like all that big a deal. You add in the secondary roads, well, yeah, but it still doesn't look like all that big a deal. But then you add in all the small Forest Service roads. Oh my gosh, there's a lot of roads out there. And maybe that alpine habitat itself is more or less intact. But this figure suggests that maybe that habitat has been fragmented to a significant degree. And so maybe that fragmentation is part of the issue. And there's the polygons where goats are still found. So we've done a bunch of work over the years. Initially, Adam Wells and Tana Buse focused on habitat modeling. We also, my colleague Cliff Rice, who's a research scientist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, did a lot of work to develop improved census methods. And then the focus of our work over the last few years has been on to understand the genetics of mountain goat populations, and that's what I'm really going to focus on today. And most of what I'll be presenting you, all of what I'll be presenting you, is work done by my two graduate students, Andrew Shirk and Leslie Parks. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that Melissa's doing right now and the restoration plans we have for the years to come. This is one of the goats we put a radio tag on years ago, and we radio tagged about 60 mountain goats throughout the Cascades. Students got involved in some of that work. Some of that work was done with ground-based captures, and other work was done with helicopter-based darting of goats. Some of the work that Cliff Rice did was involved in developing what's called a sitability bias model. The idea is that when you fly over in a helicopter and you see a certain number of goats, okay, I saw six goats, but how many did I miss? And so we developed methods to try to correct for that. But again, the focus, what I really want to focus on here is this discussion of genetics. So this is a slide that my grad student Andrew Shirk put together that I think sort of nicely summarizes how genetics might feed back and genetic diversity might feed back to influence the viability of populations. So population geneticists distinguish between the population size, that is the census population size, the number of animals running around on the landscape. All you need to do is count the number of legs and divide by 4, right? That's the population size. But what's really more relevant for understanding population viability is what's known as the effective population size. And you know, it turns out that a stunningly small percentage of the population is actually involved in reproduction. Obviously, the young animals, the animals that are sexually immature, well, they're not reproducing, and that's a lot of the population. And then with the adult females, you know, the adult females, they don't have offspring every year. They might, on average, have offspring a little more often than every other year. A little more often than every other year. And then the males, you know, it turns out that a stunningly small percentage of the population of the adult males are actually reproducing. For one population up in Alberta that's been intensively studied, out of a population of about maybe 200 animals, census population of about 200 animals, there were about 2 or 3 adult males that were responsible for siring all of the or 95% of the offspring. Most of the adult males aren't successful at reproducing. So the effective population size for many ungulates might be in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% of the census population, which is kind of interesting. Well, okay, so genetic diversity, what influences genetic diversity? Well, Andrew put together this really nice slide that I think nicely illustrates it. What is it that can increase genetic diversity? Well, ultimately, all of the sort of new genetic variability in the population is a result of mutations. But mutations are stunningly rare, very, very low mutation rate. But ultimately, that's where all new genetic variability comes from. Then on the other hand, some things that can result in the reduction in genetic diversity are these things called inbreeding and genetic drift. And so the genetic diversity of the population represents sort of a balance between mutations on the one side that can increase genetic diversity and these other two factors that can result in the loss of genetic diversity. And as the effective population size gets smaller, it sort of changes the balance. And as effective population size goes down, then inbreeding and genetic drift become a more powerful force and will drive down genetic diversity at a much faster rate than mutation can increase genetic diversity. Well, what about these two factors, inbreeding and genetic drift? Well, inbreeding is less than desirable because it reduces heterozygosity. With small populations, you're more likely to have closely related individuals interbreed, and that reduces heterozygosity. It also, when you reduce heterozygosity, when you get an individual that's carrying 2 copies of a particular allele, you're more likely to unmask deleterious recessive alleles, and this is going to reduce survivorship and fecundity. Genetic drift is simply the loss of genetic diversity by chance. You know, if you have a small population, you have this possibility that an individual carrying a unique allele might be lost just by chance. You know, so think about a small population of humans, and there's only one individual in the population that has, I don't know, blue eyes, and they get hit by a truck crossing the road. Well, boom, you've just lost that particular trait from the population. And that's more likely to happen with really small populations. And this serves to reduce the evolutionary potential for the population. So as you lose genetic diversity, you're going to reduce population size because of those reductions in survivorship and fecundity. And that, in turn, is going to reduce the effective population size, and you get into sort of a downward spiral. Now, migration is a factor that can also bring sort of fresh blood, if you will, into the population. Migration can serve to reverse or slow down the deleterious effects or the loss of genetic diversity that results from inbreeding and genetic drift. So if you have a small population, you're going to have increased inbreeding, increased genetic drift. And if you isolate that population, if you reduce the rate of migration, that's also going to accelerate this sort of downward spiral. Okay, so why does that matter? Why does genetic diversity matter, specifically with mountain goats? Well, one of our collaborators up in British Columbia, that population I mentioned in Alberta, where they have a population of 200 animals that they've been following for about 15 years. They've marked every individual in the population. They know the lineage of every individual in the population. They know who the mom and dad is for every goat out there. They've gotten blood samples from every animal. They've genotyped every animal. This is some data collected by a guy named Julien Mangui. He's French-Canadian. And so for all these different individuals, he had the heterozygosity, think of it as genetic diversity, for all of these individuals in the population. And he tracked their survival rate for these different individuals. And what you can't help but see here is that, okay, here's heterozygosity. And with low heterozygosity, the juvenile survivorship is very, very low. With higher heterozygosity, the survivorship is dramatically higher. And if you fit a line to that curve and take a look at the average heterozygosity for populations in the middle of the mountain goat distribution up in Canada, average heterozygosity is around 0.55, and that corresponds to an average juvenile survival rate of about 85%. In contrast, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, what we found here in Washington State in the Cascades is that the average heterozygosity is more like 0.37. And that suggests an average juvenile survival rate of considerably lower, closer to 75%. So just looking at one figure suggests that we could have a problem. This could be part of the problems that are facing mountain goats in Washington State. Oh, and I forgot to say that hunting levels have declined dramatically. We used to have about 300, issue about 600 permits and have about 300 animals killed. Currently today, it's down to the point where they only issue about a dozen licenses a year in Washington State. And it's been that way since the early 1990s. So we've been to the point where harvest levels have been way low for 25 years, yet the populations haven't rebounded. Why not? I think this is part of the reason. Okay, so what did we do? Well, the work that I'll be describing is in this area which is referred to as landscape genetics. We're interested in what's the genetic structure of the mountain goat population in Washington and southern British Columbia. Do we have a single well-mixed population? Do we have a lot of migration going on? Or are there enough barriers to gene flow out there that we have discrete populations that are genetically distinct from one another? And how does genetic diversity vary across the landscape? And how do these natural and anthropogenic landscape features influence dispersal success and gene flow? So those are the questions that we set out to address with this work. Andrew was the first student I had to to explore this area of landscape genetics. He went out and, well, based on all those animals that we had radio tagged, we already had about 60 blood samples from mountain goats scattered across the Cascades. Andrew went out and collected a lot of additional samples using various techniques, including biopsy darts, which the biopsy dart is, we use the same gun that we use to shoot tranquilizer darts to capture animals for radio tagging. But the biopsy dart, you can see there's a picture right there. It's on the tip. Instead of having a needle, it's got sort of a little punch, kind of like a paper punch almost. And it's, the inside diameter is a couple or 3 millimeters. And so you have to sneak up on the goats. You have to, effective range is about 30 yards. And then you wait until they're looking the other way and you shoot them in the butt with the biopsy dart. And the biopsy dart bounces out and it takes a little plug of tissue. And you might think, well, doesn't that really hurt them? Well, it probably stings, but Andrew's experience has been that, you know, you have 6 or 8 goats there and you shoot one in the butt and they sort of jump a little bit and they look around like maybe they got stung by a bee, and then they go back to eating. And then you can shoot the next one and the next, you know, so he might be able to get half a dozen, you know, just like that without them running away. It's pretty amazing. And we also got samples from a variety of other sources. And Andrew, and we also got a few samples from the Olympics. And the reason we wanted to get samples from the Olympics was that we knew that the origin of the Olympic goats was from southeast Alaska and northern BC. So we predicted that those animals would be genetically very different than the native Cascade goats. And recall that way back in the 1980s, we had about 150 of those Olympic goats that were released in the Cascades. So one of the things we were curious about is whether or not we could see any genetic evidence of those Olympic goats surviving and interbreeding with native Cascade goats. So we got a few samples from the Olympics. And then Leslie Parks came along and followed up on Andrew's work and expanded the sampling up into British Columbia, because based on Andrew's work, we wanted to better understand the genetic relationship between goats in the Cascades and those larger populations up in British Columbia. So Leslie collected another 127 samples. Most of those samples were based on collecting scat. So I had students that spent the whole summer backpacking through the Cascades, scooping poop, because poop is a good source of genetic material. And one of my great regrets in my career is that I never got to be a fly on the wall when those students went home and proudly told their parent that they'd just gotten this paid internship to spend the summer going out and collecting mountain goat poop. And their parents are thinking, this is what I paid for 4 years of college for? But so I never got to be there. It's a great regret. Okay, so what do you do with that? Well, for this genetic work, we're focusing on what's known as microsatellite DNA. And microsatellite DNA is DNA that's not currently coding for protein. And so it's not, because it's not currently doing anything. It's not currently coding for protein. It's sort of, you know, I would say, think of it as, you know, those 3 pairs of shoes that are buried in the back of your closet you haven't worn for 3 years. That's kind of what microsatellite DNA is. It's not currently doing anything. So it's not under selection. And so if you have animals that are genetically different with respect to their microsatellite DNA, it implies there hasn't been much gene flow between those populations over the preceding few generations. So you genotype all these animals, and then we look to see how genetically distinct they are. Do we have one well-mixed population? Are all of these animals genetically pretty much the same? Or do we seem to have discrete groups? And to analyze that, we use a program called Structure. And this is the output. And the way you interpret this, each of the horizontal lines there represents one individual. And you know, for example, over here, there's these blue lines. Right up there, you see a blue line that goes most of the way across. That means there's a very high probability that that individual is a member of the blue group. And then, okay, we've got some green animals. And you know, for the most part, you can see most animals are mostly one color. But you see some up there that seem to be a mix. There's some about halfway up to there that's like 50% purple and maybe 40% yellow and I don't know, 10% red. So the proportion of that line that's a given color tells you the probability that that individual is a member of one group or another. And so sorting that out, it looks like, here's the Olympic National Park goats in blue down at the bottom. And you can see in the South Cascades, there's a few individuals that seem to have a high proportion of blue. We interpret that as those are individuals that are descendants of those Olympic National Park goats that were released in the Cascades in the 80s, and they've interbred with native Cascade goats. And similarly, way up there at the top in the light blue, you see there's a lot. Those are individuals from the Coast Range of British Columbia. The red, those are from the Selkirks and the Purcells in British Columbia. And then the North Cascades seems to be sort of a hodgepodge. And to sort of clean up the analysis a little bit, we said, okay, well, let's take the Olympic National Park goats and put those aside, take those out, and let's remove what we call admixed individuals, those individuals that seem to be descendants of the Olympic goats that we found in the Cascades, and rerun the analysis. And then here, the results are a little cleaner. Here we seem to have a more or less discrete population in the South Cascades, another population in the North Cascades and the Okanagan, another group that's in the Selkirks and Purcells, and then another group that's in the Coast Range. So we seem to have those 1, 2, 3, 4 pretty distinct populations, which is interesting and leads to the obvious question of, well, what is it that's structuring those populations? Let's take a look at where those individuals are on the landscape. Let's take each of those individuals and throw them out and put them out plot them on the map to see where they fall out. And here's the results. The blues you can see mostly in the North Cascades, the yellows mostly in the South Cascades. We seem to have a few yellows in the North Cascades, but not very many. There's the Selkirks and Purcells over there. There's the Coast Range of British Columbia up there. There's a few individuals that seem to be in the wrong place, but for the most part, we seem to have individuals grouping in a pretty coherent fashion across the landscape. And one of the things that fell out, we didn't go into this focusing on the effects of roads, for example, but one of the things you can't help but notice is this dark line right here, that's the I-90 corridor. How about that? It seems to be that there's a distinct break in the genetic structure of mountain goat populations that corresponds pretty strongly to the I-90 corridor. The I-90 corridor doesn't seem to be an absolute barrier because we have a few yellows up here in the North Cascades, but it seems to be a pretty substantial impediment. Same thing right here. This dark line is what's known as the Coquihalla Connector, which is a major freeway in British Columbia. And right here, this is the Okanagan Valley. Now, another thing we can do, another analysis we can do with the genetic data is to create, if you will, sort of a topographic map, or the probability of encountering an animal that's a member of that North Cascades Okanagan genotype. And you can see the probability of encountering that North Cascades genotype in the North Cascades is very high, not surprisingly. But then these lines here, these contour lines, show you how the probability of encountering that genotype changes as you move across the landscape. And you can see, in particular, there's a very steep gradient that's closely associated with I-90. So right at the I-90 corridor, the probability of encountering a North Cascades genotype changes dramatically. There's a very steep gradient there. And then up there in the upper right, you can see there's another reasonably steep gradient, not as steep, but still a pretty steep gradient as you go across the Okanagan Valley. And another gradient as you move to the northwest towards the Coast Range of British Columbia. So something's going on. There's something in the landscape there that restricts the movement of goats, restricts the dispersal success of mountain goats. And the other thing that's interesting, historically we used to use, one of the reasons we got into radio tagging goats was we thought that the radio tags would give us some information about dispersal. But in hindsight, the radio tags gave us a lot of information about day-to-day activities and habitat selection on a daily basis and a seasonal basis, but didn't give us very much information at all about dispersal, specifically because dispersal is a rare event. And more often than not, dispersal events end badly in the sense that it's risky to disperse. When an animal disperses, they're going into habitat that they're not familiar with. They're going into places they don't know where they're going exactly. They're more vulnerable to predation. And so more often than not, a dispersing animal dies in the process. But the interesting thing about genetics is that the genetic structure of the population only archives, only records dispersal events that are successful, with success defined as a dispersal event in which the animal, number one, survives, and number two, it successfully reproduces. If it doesn't successfully reproduce, it doesn't count. It's not recorded in the genetics of the population. So how can we figure out what's creating those steep gradients in the genetic structure of the population? Well, here's the approach we take. And this is becoming an increasingly common approach. We didn't invent this, but this is a technique that a lot of people are using right now. The basic approach is you take all your genotypes, and we had nearly 300 genotypes. And so we create what's called a genetic distance matrix. That is, based on the genotypes, we can calculate the genetic distance between every pair of individuals in our sample. So if animals are closely related to one another, not necessarily that they're siblings or anything like that, but they're members of the same population, their genetic distance is going to be small. If they're from very different populations, the genetic distance between them is much greater. And so the idea is that if you have two individuals that are this far apart and they're genetically very closely related to one another, again, not that they're siblings, but they're genetically similar, then that implies that the intervening landscape is very permissive to movement. It's easy to disperse between those two locations. On the other hand, if you have a different pair of individuals that are genetically very different from one another, then it implies that there's something about the intervening landscape that creates resistance to movement. Makes it hard for animals to successfully disperse. So how do we tease that apart? Well, we come up with a series of hypotheses about things in the landscape that we think might impose resistance to movement, might make it difficult. So you come up with one hypothesis that says, well, I think it's all about elevation. I think that animals want to stay at this elevation, and if they move to higher elevations or lower elevations, it becomes harder to move. So that's one hypothesis. Or you can say, well, no, I think it's all about land cover. I think mountain goats want to move through alpine plant communities, and if they encounter forested plant communities, the resistance is much greater. Or any one of a number of other things. You can say, I think it's all about roads. We think that freeways create a lot of resistance to movement, but maybe the North Cascades Highway, a 2-lane highway, is a little bit less resistance. So you come up with all these different hypotheses. And then what you do is you calculate what's known as the least cost path distance. So there are these computer algorithms that on that resistance surface, you say, okay, I have point number 1 and point number 2. What's the pathway between point 1 and 2 that accumulates the least resistance along that path? And it's almost never a straight line. It's generally some sort of a winding pathway. So for each of your hypotheses, you have a landscape resistance matrix that gives you the least cost path resistance between every pair of points. So you have all these different hypotheses, and then you use what's called a Mantel's test to look at the match between your genetic distance data and your hypotheses about landscape resistance. So that's the basic approach. And skipping a whole lot of the computational details, here's the answer. What Leslie did for her work is she said, okay, well, based on that sort of that contour map that I showed you, it looked like there was something going on between the North Cascades and the Coast Range of British Columbia. So she said, okay, let's take all the animals in the North Cascades, all the animals in the Coast Range, and do the analysis that I just described, just with that subset of the samples. And she tested that genetic distance matrix against a whole bunch of different hypotheses, and skipping a lot of details, turns out it's mostly about roads. Not entirely, but mostly it's about roads. Coquihalla Connector being the major road there, but there are a number of other roads between those two populations as well. There's the Trans-Canada Highway, the number 1. There's also the sea to sky highway, which is really hard to say since we have the ski to sea parade thing coming up, and I always get it mixed up. The sea to sky highway that goes up to Whistler. So the number of roads there. Between the North Cascades and the Selkirks and Purcells, there were two factors that came into play. One being land cover, because the Okanagan Valley is a sort of a broad valley with a lot of agriculture in it. So there's a lot of open country that's heavily developed for agriculture and other residential areas and other things like that. So that becomes a big factor. The other factor is distance to escape terrain. Again, the terrain between the North Cascades and the Selkirks includes a lot of low elevation areas and areas with sort of gently undulating terrain. And mountain goats, as we've said at the outset, mountain goats want to stay really close to those cliff sites that provide the escape terrain from predators. And it turns out that in that area, escape terrain is a limiting factor. And again, between the North Cascades and the South Cascades, it's mostly about roads and mostly about the I-90 corridor, but other roads as well. And what about genetic diversity? How does that vary across the region? Well, focusing on that upper left panel there, that's heterozygosity, and recall that relationship that I showed you earlier. And you can see that heterozygosity varies quite a bit. Up there in this area, up around Manning Park, and these areas just across the border in Canada, you can see that heterozygosity is quite low, down around 0.25 or so. Up here in the Coast Range, it's very, very high, up closer to 0.6. And in these various areas in the North Cascades and the South Cascades, the genetic diversity, the heterozygosity is quite low. So that implies quite a bit of regional variation in juvenile survival success across this region. So what are we doing next? Well, there's active discussion going on right now in Olympic National Park. It's been quite a few years since they did that translocation effort in the 1980s. Again, the populations are up a bit. They're not up as high as they were in the mid-1980s, but they're up around 400 or so. And once again, the Olympic National Park is revisiting this issue of whether they want to have this non-native species in Olympic National Park. So they're going through an environmental impact assessment to consider that issue, and they're almost certainly going to recommend capturing and removing at least a couple of hundred goats. What they do with the rest is an open question. They may actually try to eliminate goats from Olympic National Park, although that would be challenging. But at this point, it looks highly probable that in the summer of 2017, Olympic National Park will capture in the neighborhood of a couple of hundred goats and make them available to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to translocate to the Cascades to try to augment the populations in the Cascades. Again, the populations there are considerably lower than they were back in the 40s and 50s, and despite, excuse me, now 25 years of little or no hunting pressure, the populations haven't rebounded. I'm convinced that that lack of rebound is at least partially the result of the low levels of genetic diversity that we see in the Cascades. The Olympic goats are heavily inbred because, founder effect from that founding population of only 12 individuals, but they carry genetic traits, they carry alleles that don't occur in the Cascades. So adding those Olympic goats to the Cascades will increase local genetic diversity and could help to kind of jumpstart those populations and get them into a positive growth trajectory and hopefully lead to restoration of mountain goat populations in the Cascades. And my current graduate student, Melissa Oscarson, that's her thesis project. She's doing a bunch of modeling work to evaluate different translocation scenarios. What if we put 20 goats here and 20 goats there versus concentrating 40 goats here? And what if we, what if we add, a group with this sex ratio versus a different sex ratio? What if what difference does it make? And what if we cluster the releases in a given area versus scatter them out over larger areas? How would those different translocation scenarios, what's the likelihood that those different scenarios would have a positive outcome? It also would be interesting to consider grabbing some goats from the Coast Range of British Columbia, and although the Canadians would be more than willing to have us do that, the costs and logistics associated with doing that probably would make it prohibitive, but it's something we're considering at any rate. And the work that I've presented here, again, virtually all the work that I've shown you here has been work done by my graduate students. Mostly I've focused on work done by Leslie Parks, but my other grad students have done a lot of work as well. And all the work has been made possible by generous support from a whole bunch of different groups over the years. So that's all I have to say. Be happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
Would goat bridges also be an idea?
Well, you recall Jen Watkins from Conservation Northwest came and talked about the I-90 wildlife crossing effort there, the effort to build bridges there. And the answer is, maybe, hopefully, one of the motivations for building those bridges, I mean, they weren't built for mountain goats, but mountain goats was certainly one of the species that was in mind when they built those bridges. So we'll see, is the answer. We hope. Yeah. Yes?
Any idea why the males breed so much?
It's just, it's just the nature of ungulate populations. You get a few dominant males that are able to basically take over and shove all the other males out of the way. The general sort of structure for mountain goats is that if you see a group of mountain goats, it is, I guarantee you, it's going to be a group of adult females and their offspring from the last few years. So there'll be adult females, breeding females that are age 3 and up, and then animals of both sexes that are 2 years of age and younger. And when they get to be about 2 years of age, then the males, the 2-year-old males, kind of go off. They leave the nanny group, and they're solitary. If you see a solitary goat, it's almost certainly an adult male. But then during the rutting season, the dominant males will sort of, join up with that nanny group, and they'll do all the breeding, and they'll keep other males away.
Is your genetic data then biased because you aren't getting those individual males that are just out there?
Oh, we had both. We had both adult males, or both sexes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if the reproducing males were somehow killed or something like that, other males would take their place?
Yes. Yeah, and one argument you get, an argument, or I shouldn't say an argument, but I did have a hunter ask me the question that, well, gee, it seems like genetic diversity is an issue, and all the breeding is being done by a handful of males. Wouldn't it be helpful for us to go out there and kill the dominant males so that you'd have more variety in which males were participating in reproduction? And the answer to that is, well, yeah, I suppose, but if you're eliminating the dominant male is the dominant male for a reason, because it's the strongest one. It's the one with the best combination of genetic traits that enables it to be successful. So do you really want to take out the most successful males? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
With that hunting also, they're hard to distinguish by sex by looking at them, but you can distinguish most of their sex by behavior. Wouldn't that be something to consider when people are getting those few hunting permits?
Yes, and in fact, now, not just in Washington, but both in Canada and other areas in the lower 48 where there is a little bit of mountain goat hunting in some other states, Montana, for example. And in all those cases, now, if you get a permit to hunt goats, a condition of that permit is, okay, here's a PowerPoint presentation with a whole bunch of pictures of males and females, and you go through all those slides, and then you have to take a little test to see if you can distinguish. And that's been helpful, but even under those circumstances, it's still really hard. Yeah. I mean, if I'm out there...
helpful 40 years ago.
Yeah, yes, it would have been. But even with, even, you know, a really diligent hunter, you know, with the best of intentions, having gone through that training, you know, are they going to be able to perfectly distinguish? Yeah, no. But it helps. You know, it's definitely very, very helpful. And, you know, I've looked at a lot of goats when I'm out there in the field, you know, at 1,000 meters away with a high-powered telescope. Sometimes I can tell and sometimes I can't. You know, you have to be really close. You know, and hunters are often taking shots from considerable distances. Other questions? Yes?
I heard some time back that some people were in the Olympic forest and one of the large male goats attacked. Are they that aggressive?
Yeah, that was a really unfortunate case that happened about 3 or 4 years ago. In the Olympics, you know, goats get in some areas of the Olympics near heavily used trails. The goats get really used to seeing hikers, and there was one area where there was a group of goats on a heavily used trail that were they're heavily habituated to people, not scared of them at all. And the Park Service had actually put up signs that, hey, there's some ornery goats up here, be careful. And there was a group of, I think it was one gentleman and a couple, I think there were 3 or 4 people. And they stopped and had lunch, and there was this one goat that was being kind of ornery. And the guy said, well, you know, you guys go down there and I'm going to try and shoo this goat away. And the goat head-butted him and hit him in the leg and stabbed him in the leg with his horn. And you know, goats from a distance, they look really cute, but when you get up close, those horns are really sharp. And so punctured his leg and severed his femoral artery, and the guy bled to death before anybody could get to him and help. And he died. And it was and this family has subsequently sued the Park Service for $10 million. You know, they said, well, you should have done something about it. Well, prior to that event, there had never, ever in the history of the planet ever been a case, a documented case, of a goat actually attacking a person. So if the day before that had happened, if the Park Service had said, you know, we're going to go up there and shoot that goat, everybody would have screamed bloody murder and said, well, why? There's never any documented case of a goat ever attacked. Why would you do that? So, you know, it was a tragic, really unfortunate event. It was just incredibly bad luck. The guy didn't do anything wrong. He just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And those goats were really habituated to people. You know, and I've been some places where, you know, you can get up to within, you know, 50 or 80 yards or maybe even 30 yards of goats, and other places where, you know, from 300, 400 yards away, the goats see you coming and they take off. So it just depends, you know.
Are there places in Glacier National Park where they walk like 3 or 4 feet in front of you?
Well, yeah, and the Enchantments is a place that people always talk about the goats there. Goats are, particularly in the spring of the year, they're sort of desperate, they're craving salt. And goats in the Enchantment are sort of infamous for, if you're hiking up there, they will follow you around and wait for you to pee so they can lick up your pee. And it's never happened to me, but I've been told that when you're out there peeing, the goats are uncomfortably close when you're in a rather exposed situation. Other questions? Okay, well, unfortunately, this summer I will not be taking on any interns to work with me on this project, but next summer I probably will. So stay tuned. Thanks.